So this talk is on interactive dialogue. I'm going to go over the tools that are available, and this is just a sampling of the most commonly used tools, and then some tips for writing your interactive dialogue. So this is specifically for branching dialogue more than barks and monologues and things like that. So the two things, again, we're going to cover are tools and writing tips. And we're going over tools first. When you are deciding on a tool to use for writing your interactive dialogue, there are several things that you want to consider when you're evaluating all the choices of tools. First and foremost, as a tools developer, I look at how the writer can iterate. That is, write content, test it out, make changes, and just go through that loop to keep refining your dialogue. And then the pipeline for getting that dialogue actually into your game or into your game engine so that you can pull it in, test it, make it run, pull it back out, iterate on it, and get feedback. When it's in the engine, it's useful if the tool can give you control over the state of variables and flags and other information that happens both in the game and within the conversation. And if those two can talk to each other, that's very useful. Interactive dialogue needs to branch based on those values, so you need some kind of powerful enough system to be able to perform logic and decisions to decide which branches to go down. And related to this also is an ability to save that information in saved games or across scene changes, things like that. And if the tool or the tool's integration with your engine supports that, it's less that you have to do on your own to make it work. And that includes accessing other data in the engine, such as maybe in your conversation, you give an item to the player or take away an item from the player. Things like that. If you can integrate that into the engine and into the process of writing, it'll make your life as a writer a lot easier. Also, half of dialogue presented to the player is UI. So if you can control that UI, for instance, control which character portraits are shown on screen, if you have character portraits, or show how certain player choice menus are shown. Maybe you want to show them differently for different types of choices. If you have that kind of control that you can specify in your tool, it again helps a lot versus trying to finagle that after the fact in the game engine. And a few other things that you may or may not be interested in, but good to be aware of, good to know if a tool can support it in case you need it in the future. One of them is localization, that is being able to have different translations into different languages and manage that within your writing tool. And being able to handle voiceover, particularly if you can test that voiceover in your writing tool. That's really helpful because that gives you a sense of how it plays and the timing and how it comes across to the player. If the tool can also track which lines have been recorded and which haven't, it helps your voice director keep track of what needs to be done, maybe which lines need to be re-recorded. So if you can use a tool that tracks that for you, it means you don't need to try to keep a separate spreadsheet or something in sync with it. So given all of those concerns about a tool, there are a number of tools that meet most or all of those. And this is going to be just a brief survey of some of the most popular tools that are available for writing interactive dialogue. We'll start with the free tools. One of the most popular is called Twine. It's a visual node-based dialogue editor. One of its pros is that it can output to HTML, so you can just make a full game in Twine and put it on a website, and it'll be fully playable in HTML there. And of course, it's free. Some of the cons are that the way Twine is designed, it can be really messy for big projects, because each dialogue is essentially a separate Twine project. It can get very difficult to organize all of these nodes. And the way logic is handled, that is decisions on which branch to take, is done in line with your text, which in a way is kind of convenient for writing because you can write and keep the writing flow going, but it's very hard to separate that logic from the actual text, which also has implications in your engine. There's also no built-in localization, and Twine itself doesn't provide any engine integrations, although there are some third-party engine integrations, and there is a nice format called Twison that you can export to that exports your Twine conversations to a JSON file, which at least makes it easier to pull that JSON into your game engine. The final con that I will mention is that Twine is a single user application. So if you're writing a conversation, another writer cannot go in and make changes at the same time. Yarn is another popular choice. Unlike Twine, it provides integrations for several engines, so it's quite easy to import into those engines. It does have localization support. It does have a plugin for writing your Yarn content in VS Code, and again, it's free. My personal cons are that the Yarn devs make frequent breaking changes to Yarn. And so you either need to update all of your Yarn content or stick with a version of Yarn for a project. But if you're trying to follow with the latest and greatest, you'll find quite frequently that you have to update all of your Yarn for changes in their syntax. And unfortunately, since version 2 and above, they have not created a visual editor. So you'll be writing your content in VS Code or Notepad or something like that in plain text. But you'll also be doing the same with another tool called Ink. This is made by Inkle Studios of 80 Days fame. And this is a very writer-friendly format. It lets you write in sort of a stream of consciousness flow. The logic is mixed in with the text, but also text manipulation. That is, choosing variations on words and incorporating variables into your text is just right in the text. So if you are a traditional writer, Ink is a very friendly way to get into interactive writing. They do provide a Unity engine integration, so it's easy to bring into Unity, and it's free. Unfortunately, since everything is kind of nested in that text, it can be very hard to see all the different branches. You need to kind of go through, and you can look at the indents and get an idea, but sometimes you'll link from one area to another just using a special tag in text. So following all those paths can be difficult visually. Unfortunately, because it has this powerful text manipulation, it is really not practical for Inkle to provide any kind of localization support because you never know what the text is going to be if it's generated at runtime based on all of your variables. So what Inkle has done is they'll write a separate Ink file, including all the logic and everything, for each language that they support. So you'll see that their games typically don't support a lot of languages because it's a huge amount of work to do that and then keep them in sync. If you're not localizing to other languages, though, and you're a writer, Ink is a great choice. Other free tools that I'm just going to briefly mention, some engines have or are based around dialogue, such as RenPy for visual novels, Inform for text games. And I'll also mention Homebrew. That is building your own dialogue tool. It's free in the sense that you don't pay for a tool, but it's not free in the sense that you're paying to spend the time to write, debug, and maintain your own tool. So there are pluses and minuses to that. You can get to know that tool intimately, and it does exactly what you want, but it takes a lot of time, and when you're making a game, time is money. So you may be interested in some paid tools. I'll briefly go through these. The first one being Arcweave, which is a web-based tool. It's a really nice tool that has really come up in the past couple of years. It has a lot of great features. It is web-based, and multiple users can hop onto the same page at the same time, so they can all be making changes in your Arcweave project simultaneously. It is under really active development, and the developers listen to your feature requests and implement them fairly quickly. And they provide importers for all of the major engines, including Unreal and Unity and Godot. But one of the cons, which is also a pro, is that it's web-based. So if you don't have access to the internet, or if their service goes down, which is extremely rare but can happen, you can't access the project for a while. Artisy Draft, on the other hand, runs locally. It, again, is very feature-rich. It's been around for quite a while, so it's really developed a big library of features around it. It has a powerful plugin system for things like voiceover and localization, and in fact, you can write your own plugins if you want to tie in something else, maybe a custom quest system. They also provide importers for different engines. I will say, personally, I find the Unity importer to be a little bit clunky, but it's solid. So if you don't mind the importer being a little bit slow, it's a good way to go. And it does do multiplayer, but it's only on Windows. And to do, not multiplayer, multi-user. It's only on Windows. It's not a web app. For the multi-user, you need to set up a server. They give you a process for that, but you need a server, and that's where the primary content is hosted. Celtics, which is known in the screenwriting industry, it's kind of like a competitor to Final Draft, sold their interactive dialogue tool to, they formed a company called Backlight and renamed this product Gem. Since it comes from the Celtics folks, it is very screenwriter friendly. One of the major formats that you can type in is just a screenplay, essentially. So it's great for the linear parts of your dialogue, and then you can branch out various nodes. But when you get to a linear part, you can resort back to that very comfortable screenwriter style. So if you're coming from a screenwriting background versus, say, a book writing or playwriting where you might, a book or short story writing where you might use ink. If you're writing plays or screenplays, then Gem would be a good one to look at. It is also web-based. It's multi-user like Arcweave, so you can jump in with other people and edit all at the same time. But again, it's web-based, so if you don't have access to the internet, you have temporary problems. And they don't provide engine import, so it's up to you to do that. They can export to JSON, and you can read in that JSON and interpret it, but as Joe knows, since he helped me a great deal with importing into the dialogue system, it's a lot of work. A couple others that are personal favorites of mine, although not as popular anymore, include ChatMapper. ChatMapper is specifically for dialogue. Some of these other tools are like Dialogue Plus, but ChatMapper only does dialogue. Personally, I find that it does it really well. It has all of the features that you'd ever need, like built-in localization, voiceover, export to all kinds of different formats, such as Excel, PNGs for your big visual layout of your conversation trees, CSV files, XML files. It can do it all. Unfortunately, it is under new ownership. It's really expensive right now. It's $35 a month for the basic version. And the UI is a little bit dated. But if this type of feature set and UI appeals to you and you have the budget, personally, I find it's a good choice. One other that I've actually used and some large games surprisingly still use is the editor that was provided in Neverwinter Nights and BioWare's other games of and around that era, like Dragon Age. This is the Aurora toolset. It is an outline-based editor, so if you think better in an outline versus nodes, or you like this compact format, It's a good choice. There are lots of examples that you can pull down for Neverwinter Nights games. If you have Neverwinter Nights, you can test it right in there. That's what The Witcher 1 did. The Witcher 1 was a Neverwinter Nights mod. And it's basically free because you can get it on good old games for typically $5 or less. But this tool from BioWare is Windows only. It is single user. And to pull it into a game engine, there is a tool that will export your Neverwinter Nights data into XML. And then you need to process that XML and pull it into your engine. The XML format is pretty simple, but still the whole process setting it up, it can be a bit of a headache the first time through. And I don't want to be an ad for the dialogue system, but I will mention, it's kind of obligatory, that so the dialogue system for Unity is a Unity-only plugin that works, so it has editors in the engine. And it does import all of those formats above, from Aurora all the way up to Twine. So, just going to mention that. But my favorite tool is the whiteboard. I love the whiteboard for blocking out dialogue and then refining it. If you spend money on one tool, I would recommend a whiteboard. Just a regular plain old whiteboard. You can do Miro or something like that online, but I just like the tactile availability of whiteboards. So here's an example in this screen where I've grouped certain areas that I want the conversation to go to. And then inside those, I've placed Post-it notes, like real paper Post-it notes with different topics. And I can move those around. I can erase some of these sections and create new sections. But then for each of these Post-it notes, I can actually write a conversation branch. So it's a handy way to quickly physically move ideas around that let you iterate before actually getting into a tool or getting into an engine. So that is my quick overview of some of the major tools that are available. But once you've decided on a tool, you actually have to start writing. So here are some tips that I've come across working with other writers on a slew of games that I found to be very helpful, especially for new writers or writers coming from traditional media who maybe don't have as much experience with interactive dialogue. When you're going to write some dialogue, the first thing you want to do is not write the dialogue. You want to identify certain pieces of information. First, really know, and if you can, write down the setting, where the dialogue is going to take place, and what the environment tells you, what it informs you about the dialogue. So if you're in a certain area, maybe there are certain sounds going on or certain activities going in the background, and you want to be cognizant of those as you plan out your dialogue. Dialogue happens between characters, so you really need to get to know those characters first. Just do brief, half-page folios on each character, focusing mostly on how those characters relate to the other characters, and especially those characters' goals. It doesn't need to be a background of their profession and what they have in their inventory. Really, the two important things are their goals, or their relationships and their goals. And every character has two types of goals. They have external goals, like I want to get to the mountain to defeat the dragon, but then they have their internal goal. Why do they want to get to the mountain to defeat the dragon? And very often, those internal and external goals are more interesting if they're in conflict with each other. So if you can figure that out, you'll be on a good path to having an interesting dialogue. And finally, that dialogue itself shouldn't just be there for exposition. It needs a real purpose. You need a goal for each character, and it's, again, best if those goals are kind of in conflict with each other. Even if they are friendly NPCs who are companions to your main player character, if those goals are in conflict with the other NPCs and somewhat in tension with the player, your dialogue is going to be more interesting. So once you've identified that, you'll probably want to decide on a structure for your interactive dialogue. Unlike traditional media, your structure is just line after line after line in traditional media. But in interactive dialogue, you have branching. And the more interesting that branching is, the more fun the player is going to have. So these are 4 types of branching structures that if you choose one of these and follow it, it will help you get started with your dialogue. I've included a link here to some further information about these structures, but I'll quickly go over each one. The first one, that link calls the Time Cave. That's based on an old choose-your-own-adventure book called The Cave of Time, and it's very much like your traditional choose-your-own-adventure. It grows exponentially, so with each choice, you get unique outcomes, and then those outcomes give you more unique choices, so you end up writing a lot of unique content, and it has pluses and minuses. For the player, they get lots of unique content, and it increases replayability. But for you, it's just a whole lot of work. So instead of that, you might want to do what's called the gauntlet, which is mostly a linear process for your conversation, but with these optional branches that kind of go out for a little bit to give some variety and then go back to that linear branch. So it gets you from point A to point B with a minimum of this exponential growth. These are typically seen in like visual novels, because in visual novels, you're just not going to do that kind of crazy time cave structure. And if you have an ideal golden path that you want the player to follow, this is a good structure to use. A very common structure in RPGs is the branch and bottleneck, because it gives you some of the advantage of the Cave of Time, but also helps you stay linear like the gauntlet. So at each point in this, you branch out in various ways, and then you return to a choke point so that you can branch out again. And that way, you know that you're not just continually branching exponentially. It still gives the player lots of opportunity to explore. It doesn't give you quite the replayability of the Cave of Time, but it's a great balance between the two. These are good for conversations where you're exploring a relationship with another NPC and you're kind of gradually learning new information and opening up new topics of conversation with that NPC. However, one thing you do want to watch out for is don't make the player feel like they're railroaded into those choke points. You want to try to manage it with a little bit of subtlety, but still take advantage of the choke points. And the last of the structures that I'll go over is called the hub and spoke. This is great for detective games where you start at a hub, and a lot of like older RPGs have this too, where you talk to an NPC and you have this question, tell me about ... and then you can choose different things, like tell me about the city, tell me about the mayor, tell me about the murder. And so it's a great way to explore a whole bunch of different options while still keeping things centralized. But you need to be careful, if you can, to make that hub point variable so the player doesn't feel like they are looping back to the same dialogue again and again. Really, under the hood, they are looping back to that same dialogue, but if you can vary it, it just helps hide that and makes the experience feel a little more organic. So, once you've decided on a structure, you got that blank page. And I think this is where a lot of people struggle with writing dialogue, and you want to defeat that blank page anxiety. So the process that I will typically use for this is choosing one of two starting points. One is I will figure out what does it take to make each character feel like they won the dialogue. That is, they're meeting their internal and or external goals for the dialogue. So if you can write this down, like actually write this down so that you've identified it clearly, that'll give you a great starting point for writing your dialogue. Alternatively, you can take the other approach and decide, well, there is a purpose for this dialogue, but what does each character want to not be revealed, or what do they want to be disingenuous about? So that is another way where you can say, like, well, I need to say this, but I'm going to say it in this alternate way so that I'm not revealing my secrets or not revealing my ulterior motives. And then there are two processes that you can follow for this. You can gray box it. By that, I mean blocking out just the general topics of the conversation. I will do this on the whiteboard. I like to do this physically first, and then I'll translate that into a tool. Just block it out, and then write that dialogue in just like very flat, unnuanced terms. And then I'll test it out in the engine or in the play mode of your tool. And then I'll add subtext to it, make those lines more interesting. And just add some nuance to it, and then iterate again, get some feedback on it, and you go through those again. You might need to write a little more flat dialogue, then add more nuance to it. Another approach is to figure out what that subtext is going to be first. So what is it that they are saying without saying? And then from there, how do you write the dialogue that they actually say that kind of masks what their internal dialogue is? So this is like the opposite approach, where you start with the internal dialogue and then you hide it. The characters are hiding it from each other with some sort of flat dialogue on top. And again, you're always iterating through these. You never write a dialogue and then you're one and done. Well, you can, but just like with any other part of game design, iteration, feedback will make this better. So if you choose a tool that really helps you iterate, that's going to help the process and give you less friction to iterating. Some final remarks to keep in mind as you're writing the dialogue. Don't be wordy. A lot of new dialogue writers will write freaking paragraphs for each line of dialogue. No, a few words. The less you say, the more the player can infer and let their imagination go crazy. Keep in mind the idea of momentum and different beats to the conversation. You don't want to just go straight through all as sort of a monotone, but have some highs and lows, some tension and release of tension in your dialogue. I'm repeating this subtext thing again. John Ingold did a great talk called Sparkling Dialogue, where he talks a lot about subtext. But that is what really drives your text. That flat text like, oh, I want you to go to the mountain and kill the dragon, does not interest players. It's trying to infer what the player and what the NPCs are masking when they're talking is really what makes dialogue interesting. So I recommend watching that if you're interested in writing dialogue. I've included a link here. And unlike traditional dialogue, when you are writing interactive dialogue, give the player the opportunity to express themselves with agency. That is, things that actually make things happen and have consequences. Like real consequences. It doesn't necessarily need to end the game or even change gameplay, but those consequences can just be callbacks where an NPC does a simple comment that indicates that they are, that they feel a certain way about the player. Again, it doesn't need to be things that are like, that greatly change in-game gameplay. You just want to recognize to the player every choice that the player has made. And it only needs to be just like a one-off comment, and then you forget about it. But so long as you acknowledge every choice that the player makes, it doesn't matter how big or small the effects of those are. A great pattern, and this is the link to John Ingold's talk, a great pattern is proposed by John Ingold, and this is the pattern that he uses in all of Inkel's games. And those games are crafted so well. He's like a master craftsman when it comes to dialogue. He uses this pattern where when there's a player choice, you provide 3 choices. You can either accept, that is, agree with what the NPC is saying, or reject or deny what the player is saying, what the NPC is saying, or you can deflect, that is, try to change the subject. This is a lot more interesting than like your good evil choices that you see in a lot of older RPGs. By doing this, you really give the player agency about what they want to talk about, rather than, oh, I'm the all good character, I'm the all evil character, which is kind of boring. And on the last choice of a dialogue, you drop that deflect, force the player to either agree with the NPC or disagree with the NPC. It really adds stakes to the dialogue. And if you do this, it helps avoid that tendency that we writers have of providing like a list of 20 different choices. It's more interesting to the player when there are just a few important choices rather than lots of meaningless choices. And occasionally you will want to build in what John calls trapdoors. That is, ways of kind of skipping past a block of conversation if it's not important to the overall gameplay, and jump to the next beat of it. So that's just another way. Sometimes the accept or reject, or the deflect usually, is your trapdoor to move the conversation along. And my final thought is, in any type of creative endeavor, there is craft and there is art. The craft is your technique. The games made by Inkel, really, John Ingold's insights into this just exhibit that beautiful mastery of craft. There are other games where, maybe the craft is a little shakier, but they really take risks in saying something. Maybe things that some players will like and some won't, but it moves those players who like it. A couple examples that I can give in mind of that, of games that are like really artful, are Disco Elysium. That game definitely has a strong voice, strong opinions, and 1000 Times Resist. Some people can leave it, some people can take it, but no one says that game is just like a straightforward, bland RPG. So really, I encourage you to not only focus on craft, but have a voice. Say something interesting, say something risky, have fun while you're writing it, and the players are going to have fun too, because they're going to feel something. So that is it for my talk. I see there are a bunch of questions in chat here. I can look through those first real quick, but if anyone else has any other questions after that, I'll open up the floor to that. So I see Nick mentions third-party Twine exporting, Twine to RenPy. There's also a third-party tool called Cradle to import it into Unity. I've not used tracery.io, but Brian asks any thoughts on that. So I will definitely look at tracery.io. Rick mentions 6 narrative hats. I'll just quickly go over those because I am recording this. I am trying to record going forward all of these talks so that we'll have a place to refer back to them. I really regret not recording the previous 2 talks of 2025. They were both great. So those 6 narrative hats are lore master, game writer, narrative designer, technical narrative designer, narrative UX, and narrative engineer. And in fact, for all of those hats, you do want to think about them when you're choosing your tool. For instance, if you can choose a tool that really helps out your narrative UX person, that's going to make them a lot happier and help move the project along more quickly. Lem has a nice quote here from Romeo and Juliet, and that's one that I was thinking of when I was thinking of text and subtext. So let's see. Rodrigo asks, what was the the inspiration for the dialogue system? I was actually working on a project that got canceled, but I had all the rights to the dialogue system, so I pulled that out and made that available to other Unity devs, and it turned out to be useful and popular. The first version of the dialogue system was simply a front end in Unity for chat mappers XML export. So it didn't have a dialogue editor built inside Unity, and it only imported from chat mapper. That was like 12 years ago, and it has just grown since then. Nick asks, I've heard that many game devs will write their dialogue in Excel. So Excel is good for localization, and it's good for barks, because barks are just one-offs. But Excel is terrible for branching conversation. It's a spreadsheet. How are you going to represent node graphs? How are you going to represent those branches? It's usually a disaster. They used to do it back in the 80s, early 90s, just because there were no other choices. But now that you have much better choices, I do not recommend any kind of spreadsheet program for writing interactive dialogue. However, you can use it for localization, for keeping track of voiceover lines, and things like that. The dialogue system, for instance, exports all of its lines of dialogue to CSV, or a spreadsheet format, for localization, and it can also export a voiceover script into a spreadsheet format that you can use to give to your voice actors to record which lines, to know which lines they need to record and keep track of which ones are recorded and what the names are. Rodrigo asks, do I meet many people in person that have used the dialogue system? And I feel very, very fortunate to say yes, I do. It's I'm lucky. It's turned out to be a pretty popular tool to use for developers who are working in the Unity engine. And Nick provides a link to Emily Short. Emily Short is a great thinker when it comes to dialogue. Apart from writing books and other articles, she designed a system called Versu for sort of procedural and dynamic storytelling that you might be interested in if that's the kind of thing you like. And His Majesty FGC asks, which dialogue system would you recommend for Unity 3D? That's really up to you. I gave a bunch of tool choices here, and you can go through any of those are good for Unity. Some top ones that come to mind are Yarn, Ink, and of course the dialogue system for Unity. So let's open this up. Are there any other questions that anyone has? All right, well, then I will call this done, and I will stop my presentation here. And if anyone has any games that they would like to show, it can be on deck, and let's see if we can get one person to start us off and break the ice.